In this world, everyone is a cell in the human body that is trying to survive an apocalyptic infection. Among the millions of red blood cells, Ryan is a rookie who dreams of a perfect life, until his host's body became infested with bacteria. As he continued struggling to survive, he met one of the hottest white blood cell girls, the one responsible for eliminating deadly viruses. On his first day, Ryan learned that his life mission was to deliver oxygen to all parts of the body, through a passage called the blood vessel. Once he was done studying all the pathways, the class was divided into groups and sent off to various stations. When his group arrived late to their station, the team leader screamed at them, disgusted at the fact that he has to deal with new rookies. As a punishment, he instructed each of them to pick up 2 boxes of oxygen for delivery, and said that with the current health crisis, their lives as red blood cells were about to become very miserable. As soon as the aortic valve opened up, the red blood cells began rushing through it, pushing heavy carts loaded with oxygen along the way. After getting lost while traveling to the stomach, the chief gastric cell was furious at Ryan for arriving late. Even if it's his first day, they can't afford to make any mistakes, because the body is no longer in a healthy state. The years of overworking, sleep deprivation, overeating ramen, and drinking has left the body in peril. While collecting boxes for another delivery, Ryan met a veteran red blood cell, who tried helping him deliver oxygen to the brain. On their way through the blood vessel, they noticed that it was being clogged by a brown squishy substance known as cholesterol. Roger cited the culprits, who he referred to as the LDL guys, a group of goons from the liver that occasionally used the blood vessel as their dumping site. He tried to chase after them, but the LDL took off immediately when they saw him. Roger was worried, because if this kept on going, the host would eventually have a heart attack. Once Ryan completed his first delivery trip, Roger told him to take a break, but when the team leader saw Ryan slacking off, he got angry and told him to get back to work. Suddenly, an air vent exploded right in front of them, releasing carbon monoxide into the blood vessel. The team leader was caught in the gas explosion and his body started reacting negatively to the fumes. But as Ryan tried rushing in to save him, Roger stopped him from getting closer, saying that he deserves to grovel in the dirt. The team leader and the other red blood cells who were exposed to the poisonous gas morphed into cell zombies. To top it all off, a group of ravaging bacteria appeared out of nowhere and began feasting on the zombies. As the bacteria launched towards Ryan and Roger, Lexia, a hot white blood cell, appeared and sliced through all the bacteria in no time with her blade. Ryan was stunned at the sight of the white blood cell in her huge nucleus that he couldn't help but stare. Mrs. Giant Cannonballs began fighting against the rest of the bacteria, and while Roger mourned the loss of his friend, and Ryan's mind snapped like a broomstick, Roger reminded him that their sole purpose as red blood cells was to deliver oxygen, no matter the cost, and no matter the consequence. He sacrificed himself by heading down the polluted part of the blood vessel in order to deliver oxygen to the brain. Ryan's grief worsened at the sight of losing his mentor, and he intended on following the same fate. But Lexia stopped him from meeting his demise. Together, they journeyed to the lungs and delivered the gaseous waste products. While they were there, they discovered that an episode of smoking by the host body was responsible for the carbon monoxide poisoning. Ryan wondered why the host would intentionally harm himself, but Lexia revealed that it was only going to get worse from here. On his way back, he saw a hot macrophage, whose skirt was soaked in the blood of a bacterium she had just killed. She silently walked past him, in the search for more foreign bodies to eliminate. Ryan's hands collided with the top of his cart, and the resulting sound triggered the macrophage, who quickly waved her machete in the direction of his neck. However, upon realizing that he wasn't a bacterium, she withdrew her blade and apologized for almost chopping his head off. The pain in her smile made him realize it wasn't just the red blood cells who were stressed out lately, but every other cell in the body. At the oral cavity, Ryan arrived with a canister of oxygen, only to discover that the mucosal cells were on fire as a result of an outbreak called a mouth ulcer. He rushed towards one of the fallen cells, with the hopes of getting his receipt stamped. But an explosion from the wall of the cavity sent him falling to the ground, and his receipt was consumed by the flames of the ulcer. Due to a rupture in the mouth ulcer, a variety of hideous bacteria began infesting the oral cavity. They moved closer to Ryan and he cowered in fear, and as they were about to end his life, Lexia and 2 other white blood cells destroyed all of them and saved him. They sliced through the bacteria and ate them up using a special technique called phagocytosis. Once they were done, the oral cavity became flooded with a special liquid that washed away the remains of the dead bacteria, and restored it back to normal. Lexia commended Ryan for standing strong in the face of the attack, and she took off with her students. Back at the blood vessel, Ryan and the other rookies aired out their frustrations to one another. 2 senior red blood cells walked over to meet them, in the hopes of lifting their spirits. But the sprinklers began pouring PG grape juice into the blood vessel, and one of the older red cells suggested they relax for a change, and they followed him to the largest organ in the body, the liver. He took them to a restaurant where they could let go of their worries by hanging out with beautiful cells called hepatocytes. Basically, they're fucking hookers. They offered them special drinks called ADH, which would reduce their stress by neutralizing the effects of the apple cider vinegar. Ryan was initially too caught up in his mind to have a drink, but with a little persuasion from the head hepatocyte, he chugged down a glass of ADH. The effect of the ADH had already begun working on the other red cells, and a black haze emanated from them as they let their anger out. Seeing how the rest of the workers were lazy, Ryan couldn't contain his anger and lost his temper at the head hepatocyte. The older red cell called Ryan over and tried showing him how all of them were dealing with difficulties because of the host. After a few hours, Ryan apologized to the head hepatocyte for the manner in which he spoke to her, and after a night of fun and relaxation, the red blood cells were finally ready to return to their duties. However, they were going to be 1 cell short, as the older red blood cell had gave up the ghost in the loving arms of a hepatocyte. He was taken to a special part of the building called the sinusoid, and his lifeless body was eaten up by a special type of macrophage called the Kupfer cell to release nutrients back into the body. Ryan couldn't help but cry, as he had now lost 2 red blood cells whom he considered to be close allies and mentors. Before he left, the hot girl kissed him on the cheek, but while he was blushing, Lexia appeared, so he quickly pulled his hands away. He tried explaining the situation, but she told him to be careful of gold diggers in the future. Meanwhile, in the brain, the chief brain cell urged the others to prepare for an arousal, and while they warned him of the risks associated with the body's unhealthy lifestyle, the commander insisted that they had no choice but to proceed. Within the entire body, an announcement told all the cells to abandon all their duties for this crucial task. They all gathered at the designated location, where they were briefed on their assignment. The chief brain cell explained that their mission was to create an opportunity for plot development by filling the spongy region in the man's plot. Ryan admitted to his senior that he had only delivered oxygen to the head before, so he has never experienced plot development. After letting those words out, 2 older red blood cells began bullying Ryan by cutting in front of him, and they made fun of him for never having experienced plot development. However, Lexia appeared, and when they tried mocking her for the same reason, she walked towards one of them and launched her sword at him. She was merely trying to kill a tiny insect standing in her way, but she made the guy piss himself. As Ryan expressed his gratitude, they invited him to join them on their patrol to the testes while he carried out his delivery. Together, they arrived at the testes, where the Serto-Lee cells were tasked with nurturing and caring for the sperms. Ryan was amazed at how the little sperm cells would later become the basis for the creation of all other cells in the body, and it made him more excited to participate in the plot development. He rejoined the other red blood cells, and they awaited the signal to commence their role in the plot development. The signal was given, and the red blood cells began expanding the wall of the helicine artery to increase blood flow into the man's plot. Afterwards, they proceeded to the spongy tissue and began to fill it up, transforming it into a hard Minecraft stick. The brain cells monitored the progress of the plot development, and everything seemed to be going according to plan. However, the golden compound necessary to maintain plot development started declining within the body, and in seconds, the whole operation was compromised. The red blood cells were injured in the process, as the spongy tissue became too tight for them to fill it up. They lost all hope in the mission, and the superior advised them to retreat before things got ugly. But Ryan wasn't about to go down without a fight. For the sake of the little sperm cells, he remained and tried to force his way back into the spongy tissue. At the command center, the chief brain cell had a sullen look on his face as he contemplated terminating the mission. But before he could give the order, the body started producing more of the golden compound, and the red blood cells rallied back into the man's plot to give it one last stroke. Ryan and the other red blood cells were able to induce full plot development, and the sperm cell astronauts prepared for liftoff into the female plot battlefield. Measures were put in place to ensure the safe delivery of the sperm cells, and a countdown was initiated, after which the sperm cells were launched into space to inhabit the moon. The rookie red blood cells were exhausted from the events of their first plot development, but they had finally graduated and got their V card. Ryan was particularly excited for the sperm cells to inhabit the moon, and he asked his superior about the chances of them getting there. However, the superior informed him that not all plot developments were for the purpose of creating new life, some were just for pleasure, and that there was no clear way of differentiating between the two. The thought that all their work could have only been for a cheap thrill made Ryan furious, and he fell to the ground, questioning his purpose in the world. However, his thoughts were suddenly interrupted by Alexia, who came bearing bad news about their safety. Apparently, because of the body's low resistance, the plot development had allowed for an invasion by a group of killer bacteria known as chlamydia. Alexia urged Ryan and the other red blood cells to get to safer grounds, while she and the other white blood cells attempt to hold off the HIV. At the urethra, one of the AIDS soldiers got very lonely, and he tried to develop anime plot with a hot white blood cell. However, she refused to let him treat her like an isekai elf, and he took it by force, choking her with his long tentacles. In the city, Ryan did his best to assure the other cells that everything was under control. Still, knowing how notorious gonorrhea were, the cells couldn't help but worry that their lives were in danger. Back at the urethra, Lexia and the other white blood cells took on the herpes monsters in battle, but they were quickly outnumbered. Lexia noticed how their troops dropped down like insects, and she ordered the rest of the white blood cells to retreat. The message of their shameful defeat got to the general of the white blood cell army, who declared war on the HPV cells. All available white blood cells were summoned to a military base called the lymph node to receive instructions on the next line of action. As Lexia and the other white blood cells made their way to the lymph node, they were stopped by a group of impatient red blood cells, who accused them of being lazy and insensitive. Their words cut deep into Lexia's feelings, but she showed no emotion and assured the red blood cells that the situation was being taken care of. At the lymph node, the general instructed the white blood cells to hold nothing back in ensuring that the gonococci were completely eradicated from the body. Lisa, the captain of the white blood cells, led the troops back into the battlefield. She addressed the white blood cells and made it clear that the battle ahead of them was most likely a lost cause. However, she urged them to continue fighting, as that was their sole purpose as white blood cells. Ryan was assigned to deliver oxygen to the urethra, and unlike the other red blood cells who chickened out because of the gonococci, he rose up to the occasion. He went alongside another red blood cell, Jim, who was a real scaredy cat. On their way to the urethra, Ryan and Jim saw many of the white blood cells laying lifeless in a pool of slime. After going hard at it with the syphilis, they were ambushed by a yellow fever cell, but a white blood cell sprang up from behind them, using her last bit of energy to end the bacteria. The white blood cell was picked up by a macrophage, who also warned Ryan and Jim about the danger ahead. Lisa and the other white blood cells put up a good fight against the lice, but their efforts were in vain, as the Ebola army kept on multiplying at an incredible rate. Lisa tried slashing her sword through one of them, but the impact from the bacterium's armor broke her blade in half. She kept on fighting, but in no time, more than half of her troops had been captured by the common cold. The leader of the flu made his move on Lisa, asking her to join him in developing plot, but she quickly lost her temper and stabbed him in the head. Ryan and Jim finally got to the scene of the action, and Ryan watched in despair as Lexia and the other white blood cells were being crushed to death. Lexia advised him to run away, but Ryan stood his ground and challenged the Pink Eyes to a showdown. At that moment, Ryan activated his chakras like Naruto, and a bright light fell down from the sky, stripping the malaria of their armor. The measles immediately became vulnerable, and the white blood cells took advantage of the situation and finished them off. The battle was over, and the pneumonia were history. Unfortunately, the captain and a few other white blood cells lost their lives at the battlefront, and they were given a befitting burial. At the Thymus, the helper T-cell was angry at the number of casualties sustained in the battle against the meningitis. He considered the white blood cells to be weaklings, and was determined to bring in a new era of T-cell dictatorship to the entire body. As hard as the helper T-cell tried, he had little strength on his own, so he called in an army of elite soldiers known as the killer T-cells, and put his plans into action. The killer T-cells packed into the body, looking all ripped in their matching leotards like WWE wrestlers. While delivering oxygen to the hair root, Ryan got a glimpse of the steps that went into the production and maintenance of the host's hair. He met the hair cells, a group of rapidly dividing cells, whose job was to create and nurture each hair strand. Among the men was the pigment cell, who ensured that hair retained its black colors. Back in the city, he ran into Lexia, who was still recovering from the events of the arthritis battle. She told him that she was afraid because of the previous battle, but thanked him for helping her out. The color on Ryan's face changed to match his uniform, and he told Lexia that he would always be there for her no matter what. However, the killer T-cells arrived, and their leader, Brock, secretly had a thing for Lexia, and he was pissed to see her hanging out with Ryan. To look tough, he told her not to interfere in the work of the T-cells and stormed off with his team. Back at the Thymus, the helper T-cell was in bad shape, trying to ensure that the body was completely free from infection. His workers advised him to take a break, but he was intent on showing the entire body just how important the T-cells were. Meanwhile, at the blood vessel, Ryan and Jim struggled to deliver oxygen to the hair root, as the road was badly clogged with cholesterol. Luckily, they found a narrow passage along the way, and used it as an alternative to get to the root. When they arrived, they were shocked to see that the place was on fire as a result of an attack by the killer T-cells. Because of all the stress they've been under, they turned rogue and began attacking the hair cells. The helper T-cell, who gave the order, was also reeling from the lack of sleep, that he mistook the hair cells for dangerous cancer cells. The dendritic cell tried to yell that he was making a mistake, but the helper T-cell was too far gone in his madness to listen. The killer T-cells continued wreaking havoc at the hair root, and this made many of the hair strands fall off, giving the host body a bald spot. To make matters worse, the helper T-cell decided to crank up the heat by using a special energy drink called cytokine to stimulate the killer T-cells even further. At that instant, Brock and the other killer T-cells unlocked their Super Saiyan forms like they were Goku and Vegeta, and they became hell-bent on eliminating the hair cells. Ryan, on the other hand, was more concerned about the host's social life, and he encouraged the other red blood cells to help out in delivering oxygen to protect the rest of the hair strands. All hope was lost at the hair root until a group of futuristic robots, called the steroids, arrived to save the day. Using advanced laser technology, the steroids were able to take down the killer T-cells and the helper T-cell in no time. Brock had rubbed spaghetti sauce all over his face, but he still tried to break free from the steroids to continue his rampage on the hair cells. However, Ryan was able to talk some sense into him, and he sobered up from the effects of the cytokine. Brock immediately regretted his actions, and he surrendered himself onto the steroid robots. On their way to make a delivery, Ryan and Jim slipped over some slimy fluid, ruining their uniforms, so they decided to make a stop at the kidney bathhouse for a cleanse. The bathhouse operated under the tight fist of the chief glomeruli cell, Mother Superior, who had a strict no-talking rule for all her workers. The waste products generated from all the blood cells who visited the bathhouse created the urine of the host body. Ryan couldn't help but notice that the glomeruli cells were burdened with heavy workload. He conversed with one of them, Yumi, who opened up to him about how the host's poor nutritional habits had taken a toll on their ability to keep the vessels clean. Ryan assumed that this was the reason for the slime he and Jim fell in earlier on. On their way back, Ryan and Jim picked up an unusual sound coming from behind walls of the piss pipe. To their surprise, a giant crystal smashed right into the plot vessel, and they quickly made a run while trying to alert others along the way. However, the crystal tore deeper into the wall, and the air from outside suctioned many red blood cells into the urine, changing it into red wine. After all the commotion, a laser endoscope from outside the body moved in and crushed the crystal into bits. However, this gave room for an entirely new group of bacteria to crawl their way in and invade the body. The white blood cells stepped in to prevent the bacteria from gaining access to the kidneys, while Ryan and Jim ran off to alert the glomeruli cells about the incoming crisis. The white cells charged towards the bacteria with all their might, but they were easily outnumbered. At the command center, the chief brain cell noticed their plight and he ordered the other brain cells to mobilize the macrophages for reinforcement. However, the macrophages were stuck-up princesses who hated running, so they couldn't be of help. Despite being outnumbered, the white blood cells persisted in their fight against the bacteria. However, the bacteria overpowered them, forcing many of them down the drain. At the same time, Ryan made it to the kidney, and he begged the glomeruli cells to evacuate the place before the arrival of the bacteria. The glomeruli cells succumbed to fear at hearing Ryan's warning and they began trembling. But their mother shunned Ryan and insisted that they get back to work. Yumi took the courage and walked up to her superior, pleading earnestly for her to reconsider. But before she could finish talking, a huge bacterium climbed up from the pipes and ambushed them. The bacterium launched his claws towards Yumi, but her mother blocked the attack, sacrificing herself in the process. Lexia quickly stepped in and sliced up the bacterium, but the damage had already been done. Yumi and the other glomeruli cells gathered around their mother as she told them to continue fighting on before she passed away. The bacteria had succeeded in cornering up the remaining white blood cells, and the invasion of the kidney seemed inevitable. However, a bacteria Robocop, Detective Quinolone, came to their rescue, zapping all the bacteria to death. With Mother Superior gone, Yumi had to step up as the new leader of the glomeruli cells, so Ryan encouraged her to always lead with her heart. After Jim completed his delivery for the day, he felt drained and decided it was time to take a break. However, before he could take one of the cells he recently made a delivery to rushed out, crying desperately for help. The man blamed Jim for delivering a canister of impure oxygen, which hastily transformed him into a senior citizen. After the incident, Jim was confronted by a group of cells who took out their frustration on him for his reckless behavior. However, Ryan intervened and tried explaining how oxygen can become toxic simply from traveling in bad canisters over time. At the Rookie Awards ceremony, Ryan was announced the winner of the Rookie Award, and Jim couldn't help but think back to all the times that he had shied away from doing the right thing. After the ceremony, Jim joined a group of discontented red blood cells, who told him how awful they thought the event was. They invited him to a secret location to chill out, but he refused as he wasn't in the right state of mind. As Ryan and Jim journeyed to the sebaceous gland, Jim couldn't help but feel jealous about Ryan's achievement. Reaching the hair root, Ryan sympathized with the hair cells, who expressed their frustration about the lack of hair growth since the spot balding incident. As they climbed up the stairs to the sebaceous gland, Ryan suggested carrying some of Jim's boxes, but he insisted that he could handle it himself as he was fed up with Ryan's happy-go-lucky attitude. Along the way, a canister of oxygen exploded, transforming into impure oxygen that killed off a lot of red blood cells. When they reached the filthy destination, Ryan and Jim met with the sebaceous gland cell, who was only moments away from retiring from his job. He thanked the red blood cells for their continuous hard work, while downplaying his own role as an important cell in the body. He revealed that his destiny as a sebaceous gland cell was to eventually rupture, releasing a natural lubricant around the host body to prevent it from drying up. Jim and Ryan were shocked by the huge sacrifice he had to pay for the well-being of the body. Regardless, the sebaceous gland cell accepted his fate, and he politely asked them to step outside while he prepared for his isekai mission. The sebaceous gland cell exploded, releasing the lubricant just like he said. However, the lubricant reacted with some of the oxygen tanks in the room, transforming them into impure oxygen. The impure oxygen had a pungent smell that triggered the red blood cells and the hair cells. Jim blamed himself for the accident, believing that he was cursed with always delivering impure oxygen. He tried to keep his distance from the others, but the two red blood cells from the ceremony caught up with him, and they invited him to their secret location to get a boost. Jim followed them to the small intestine, where an elixir rained down on him, transforming him into a super delivery machine. Jim became an unstoppable force, tirelessly delivering packages throughout the entire body. Whenever exhaustion loomed, he quickly replenished his energy by showering in the elixir. Ryan tried telling Jim that his heavy reliance on elixir would slowly drain all of his energy, but Jim brushed them off. To him, the stressful nature of their work demanded this energy boost. However, during a routine delivery, a rupture occurred in the capillary of the nasal cavity, forming a wormhole that began swallowing everything and everyone along its path. Ryan and Jim held on for dear life, but the after effects of the elixir made Jim too weak to continue. Feeling defeated and unworthy of living, Jim had already given up and was ready to let go. But Ryan quickly reminded him that everybody deserved a second chance. But Ryan tried telling him that he can still come back and fix his life, that it wasn't too late. Those words were the only thing Jim wanted to hear, so he became determined more to keep on living. He used every last bit of his energy to propel himself towards Ryan, who immediately pulled him into safety. After having survived through the near-death experience, something new sparked between Ryan and Jim, and they were glad to both be alive together. As the levels of carbon monoxide and PG grape juice increased within the blood vessel, the red blood cells became too exhausted to perform their jobs, so a veteran red blood cell urged Ryan and Jim to tag along with him to the liver for a detox. When they arrived at the liver, they were shocked to see that the once lively and bubbly organ had now been transformed into a cold and grimy wasteland. The head hepatocyte greeted them at their table, and she apologized for not being able to assist with their detox. She warned them to be careful when delivering oxygen to the legs, because the host's drinking spree had awakened the Dark Lord. Regardless, Ryan and Jim went ahead to deliver oxygen at the legs, but they faced a difficulty when climbing back. because the muscles of the leg could not create enough pressure to push them along the path. They took a minute to rest before continuing with their journey, but the two senior red blood cells from before, Jeff and Stan, came by and mocked them for all their hard work. Jim quietly walked away, but Jeff and Stan kept reminding him of the good times they had together bathing in caffeine. However, Ryan quickly intervened and told them to back off and leave Jim alone. As Ryan and Jim continued on their journey, the ground suddenly cracked and gave way, and a rookie red blood cell fell into the pit. Ryan and Jim immediately rushed over to the scene, only to be shocked by the sight of a massive blood clot filled with hundreds of dead red blood cells. Stan snuck up behind Ryan and kicked him into the pit, but Jim quickly caught him and held on to the edge of the pit. Jeff and Stan warned both of them to never challenge their authority again, and they left them in the pit to die. Jim was struggling to maintain his grip and was about to let go when Lexia arrived and saved them from falling to their graves. Ryan thanked Lexia as he sat down to catch his breath and admire her massive cannonballs. She escorted them away from the pit and took them along another path in order to get out the legs. All of a sudden, the ground began to shake violently, and the Dark Lord summoned a powerful wind that dislodged the blood clot and sent it flying in their direction. They immediately took cover inside a capillary to avoid getting crushed. Lexia explained to them that the blood clot could cause serious damage to the body if it got trapped in an important organ. The clot kept on rolling, picking up other red blood cells along the way, until it eventually slammed into the entrance of the lungs, causing them to shut down. As Ryan and Jim tried to take it out, they discovered that Jeff and Stan were entangled inside, and that the impact from smashing into the lungs had left them badly injured. Stan laughed out like a crazy person, announcing that the Dark Lord was on his way and that everyone would perish. The situation took a toll on the lung cells, causing them to choke and pass out. At that moment, Ryan instantly recalled a hidden passageway he had come across in one of his notes. Through that pathway, he and the other red blood cells could penetrate the clot from the inside and take it out. He led them to it and they all squeezed through the very narrow pathway to deliver as much oxygen as they possibly could. After a while, Lexia and the other red blood cells noticed that the clot had begun to fall off, which meant that Ryan and the others had succeeded in their plan. They went into the lungs and were surprised to see that the lung cells were still alive, thanks to a last-minute delivery by Ryan and his team. Lexia praised the young heroes for saving the day, and she gave Ryan a warm handshake to show her appreciation. However, the terror of the Dark Lord was far from over, as days later, Lexia was shocked to discover that all of the other white blood cells had suddenly gone missing. Ryan and his superior arrived at the host's plot to deliver oxygen, and Ryan pointed out that it had been a long time since the last plot development. His superior explained that it was due to the vessels of the man's plot becoming tighter over time. At the testes, Ryan observed that all the bed spaces for the baby sperm cells were empty. He met the Serto-Lee cell in charge, who explained to him that the host's unhealthy habits had affected its ability to produce sperm cells. It also meant that the sperm cells could no longer inhabit the moon of the female plot to create new life. Ryan was shocked to hear this, but had no choice other than continuing his morning deliveries. At the blood vessel, Jim caught up with Ryan and asked him why he had a sad look on his face. Ryan revealed that he was worried about how the body would cope, as all the cells within it were constantly decreasing. Lexia suddenly emerged from the shaft above, and she asked them if they had seen any other white blood cells lately. They said no, and she immediately knew that something was wrong. She explained to them that due to the recent surge of infections, many of the white blood cells had lost their lives in battle, leaving the body in a compromised state. She urged them to be careful while delivering, and took off to continue her search. At the lungs, Ryan and Jim watched as a group of newly admitted rookies were being taught their duties as red blood cells. Two of the rookies, Seth and Cole, sighted Ryan from afar, and they rushed over to greet the famous hero. Seth was excited to finally meet Ryan, and he asked for his autograph, but Ryan gave him a warm handshake instead. The supervisor noticed how much the rookies adored Ryan, and he asked Ryan to be a mentor to them. Since this was his first time being a senior, Ryan was intent on setting a good example for them, and even when they found it hard to lift their heavy boxes, he offered to take up some of their load. In the city, Ryan tried to help out again by making all the deliveries for the rookies, but he was slowly burning himself out from all the pressure. The rookies were exhausted from their first delivery trip, and they looked surprised at how Ryan was able to remain standing, despite working the entire time. However, Cole accidentally left out a receipt while delivering, and Ryan decided to fill in for him to deliver oxygen at the foot. Seeing how much work he was taking on, Jim was worried about Ryan overworking himself and reminded him of how horribly they were tortured by their own mentors. However, Ryan told him that he wanted to make a difference by being nicer to the rookies. At the foot, Ryan and Jim were shocked to see how filthy and worn out the place had become. From the ground, a group of ringworms were about to make them their food. But Lexia showed up and stabbed one of them in the head with her sword. She kept on slashing her blade at the ringworms, but they quickly became too much for her to handle. 2 of her students showed up to help out with the threat, but they were still outnumbered by the ringworms. The white blood cells were about to be eaten alive, when suddenly the foot became flooded with water in all directions, washing out the ringworms. Afterwards, 3 laser headlamps from outside the host body moved into the foot and burned the ringworms to dust. Lexia and the others were breathing heavily from being pushed to the wall, but the command center quickly instructed them to face off more ringworms in other parts of the body. Ryan decided to step up as well and deliver more oxygen than usual, but he quickly became exhausted and released his anger on Seth. Jim tried intervening, and he took Ryan to a secret hideout where he explained to him how being too passionate with his work could have negative side effects on his health. Ryan stared into the horizon, and at that moment he realized that the burden of their world was too much for him to carry alone. He needed to play his part to save the host, but also find the time to kick back and relax every now and then. The next morning, Ryan returned to work feeling much better, and he apologized to Seth for his outburst the day before. A senior red blood cell informed them of an emergency at the stomach, requiring many hands to deliver as much oxygen as possible. So Ryan and Jim went straight ahead and left the rookie behind. At the stomach, the chief gastric cell revealed to the red blood cells how dangerous and life-threatening their mission was. He explained that the walls of the stomach had been breached, and that their job was to ensure that it received enough oxygen, while also providing oxygen for the gastric cells that repaired it. Jim wondered whether or not to believe the chief gastric cell's claims, but Ryan assured him that it wasn't a lie, and they prepared their minds for the worst. Suddenly, the roof of the stomach cracked open, spilling hot and deadly gastric acid on 2 unsuspecting red blood cells. The chief gastric cell arrived immediately to rescue the cells, but the acid had already done its damage, scalding them beyond repair. When Jim saw this, he felt terrified about his own safety and ran off like a coward. The walls of the stomach continued to crumble under the heat of the gastric acid, and the chief gastric cell feared that the enemy was even more powerful than they had imagined. Regardless, the red blood cells continued to push forward and deliver oxygen to the stomach. Jim was able to let go of his fears, and he returned to the stomach to assist the rest of the red blood cells. When Ryan asked why he left in the first place, he lied and said that he needed a lunch break. A mighty earthquake shook the entire stomach, and a huge dragon, Heli pylori, emerged from the depths of the acid. The chief gastric cell informed Ryan and Jim that the dragon was behind the recent attacks on the stomach. It was able to survive within the stomach, using an enzyme called urease to create a force field, which made it resistant to the effects of the gastric acid. Lexia and the other white blood cells arrived to take out the enemy, but their weapons were useless against the dragon. Ryan and Jim continued with their mission to deliver oxygen to the gastric cells, but along the way, gastric acid spewed from the ground, scarring Ryan on his leg. However, he was determined to finish the mission, and he kept on moving despite his limp. The dragon slammed into the walls of the stomach, and the chief gastric cell urged Ryan and Jim to escape, as the ground under them was about to collapse. They dashed across as fast as they could, but Ryan sprained his foot along the way, and he fell to the ground, unable to continue. He was about to slide into the acid pit when Jim turned back and pulled him out, taking his place in the fall and sacrificing himself in the process. Ryan couldn't believe his eyes as Jim plunged into the gastric acid, and he tried going after him, but the chief gastric cell held him back and scolded him for being too emotional. Ryan broke down in tears as he reminisced back to the good times he had with Jim. The pain was unbearable, and he screamed, but no one was there to console him. The dragon was eventually taken down by a mechanized war machine known as clarithromycin, and all the cells in the stomach were excited. However, the gastric chief cell knew that as long as the host kept up with such horrible standards, the threat was far from over. As days passed, Ryan's heart was heavy with guilt, and he struggled to get up from bed, blaming himself for being responsible for Jim's death. In the city, a huge and unknown crystal suddenly appeared. The white blood cells and macrophages quickly stepped in to destroy the crystal, but none of their attacks were able to lay a dent on it. Realizing the challenge posed by the enemy, the chief brain cell called for the use of a more potent defense tactic known as Formation 1. The white blood cells were equipped with powerful weapons, and they launched a massive attack on the crystal. But even their ultimate attack wasn't able to bring it down. Upon witnessing this, all the cells began to run towards safety, and in the midst of the chaos, Ryan came across a lady who asked him about Jim. She insisted that it was his responsibility to look after him because he had always admired and respected him. Feeling overwhelmed by everything that was happening, Ryan decided to take a break and stop at the spleen, the place where red blood cells that have lost their functionality were filtered out, and unnecessary materials were removed. This was all done under the supervision of a high-ranking official named Zaki. Ryan slowly walked to the processing chamber and begged the chief to release his nutrients, as he had no reasons to live anymore. But instead of granting him his wish, the High Chief chastised him for his meaningless excuse. He urged Ryan to work more until he fulfilled his true purpose in life. Meanwhile, despite the relentless firing from the white blood cells, all attempts to destroy the gigantic crystal proved futile. The ongoing battle took a toll on the city, causing massive destruction, and forcing the brain cells to come up with an alternative strategy. The chief brain cells figured out that the gigantic crystal was not a foreign invader, but instead, an aggregation of uric acid in the body. Unable to bear it any longer, Ryan felt an overwhelming urge to inflict more harm to the body, with the intention of teaching the host body a lesson, urging other cells to join him as well. Despite Lexia's attempt to convince him to stop, Ryan continued to punch the wall in a fit of anger. She rushed towards him and embraced him tightly, begging him not to destroy the body, the same one his dearest friend risked his life for. Her words pierced his heart as he fell to his knees and began crying. Amid all the chaos, an ingested suppressant called colchicine put the white blood cells to sleep, in order to stop further destruction in the city. However, the chief brain cell deduced that if the host's unhealthy habits persisted, their life was about to get a lot worse. The next day, all red blood cells assembled in the heart for their daily routines, and 2 senior red cells complained about the clogged vessels, wondering if the heart would stop if the conditions became worse. The brown-haired cell asked about Ryan, but the superior had no idea where he is, and doubts that he would ever return. However, when he showed up and bowed his head, they became worried about him. His superior was happy about his return and gave him a friendly welcome, and with Seth, they set out to the stomach. When they arrived, all they found was a pit of dreary scorching heat, and Seth found it hard to endure the harsh conditions. But Ryan informed him that it was in a much better shape when he last visited, and he got flashbacks of his friend's death. Suddenly, the chief cell demanded that they should hurry. Seth tried to introduce himself, but the chief cell told him to f off.
Damn!
Ryan told Seth that the chief cell doesn't like names, but he was amazed when the chief cell suddenly called him by his name, and told him to keep on working hard. Along the way to the heart, they encountered a lot of rocks, and Ryan wondered what would happen if the heart's main vessel, the coronary artery, got blocked. As they navigated through the vessels, they saw some crushed red blood cells beneath the rocks, but the platelets arrived and cleared the boulders, creating a tiny gap for the red blood cells to pass through. However, the walls began caving in and trapped them. Recognizing the urgent situation, Ryan instructed Seth to grab any oxygen canister he could find as they rushed to supply the heart. Meanwhile, the other cells were in a confused state. Oxygen levels dropped rapidly, and in the midst of the chaos, a figure appeared on screen and requested an emergency meeting. The speaker thanked everyone for their hard work before breaking the sad news to them that they were all going to die, because the main vessel of the heart was blocked. Recognizing the various assaults the body has survived, thanks to their courageous efforts, he informs them that this is the final straw, and the body will perish. Everyone was stunned by the shocking announcement, and they demanded an explanation, throwing random stuff on the screen like he was a terrible performer on stage. They shouted at him and called him names. However, all he could do was bow and apologize for letting things reach this far. At last the heart stopped, and the red blood cells gave up, but Ryan kept looking for oxygen. Lexia dashed out to look for Ryan, but before she could ask about his whereabouts, the lights went out. The brain cells confirmed it was a heart attack, which meant that everyone was doomed. The entire body went through a total blackout, but Ryan refused to give up. As they awaited their fate, the body suddenly started to shake and the light began to wink. Ryan realized that the body was trying to revive itself. He told all the red blood cells to get ready to supply oxygen once the heart was restored, but Seth tried to talk him out of it. One of the older red blood cells told him that it was pointless and that he should just give up, but he insisted, saying he was going to work till the end. He screamed out to the heart, and the heart responded by blinking even brighter. Seeing the light shine gave everyone hope, and they all started praying fervently, calling out to the heart. The heartbeat became much faster, and with a flash of lightning, the power was fully restored. Meanwhile, the red blood cells in the coronary vessels worked furiously to free the path. Just then, a strange worm slipped in and pushed the rocks aside with a balloon, clearing the way for them. They were able to pass and get the oxygen to Ryan and the other blood cells, who transported it to all of the body's cells. The brain cell commander thanked Ryan for his efforts. Ryan also delivered oxygen to the elderly hag who was all alone, and she cried as she thanked Ryan for always remembering her. Seeing all the light gradually returning to the city, he recalled all of the memories he'd been through while surviving through the tough times, and he mourned the passing of his dear friend. The city was suddenly calm and quiet as if nothing had happened, and everyone went about their days like normal. While walking through a vessel, Ryan interrupted Lexia's fight with a giant monster and invited her out for a walk. They reflected on how the body conditions had improved a lot, and Lexia commended him for his diligence and for his major development. Hearing her words, he decided to confess his feelings for her, and she was so embarrassed her face almost transformed into a red blood cell. While they were at it, the walls began to crack and a needle tube burst through. Lexia ordered everyone to run away, but they were all dragged by the strange power of the tube. Ryan grabbed Lexia's hand, but she begged him to let go so he wouldn't be sucked in. But it was too late. He was knocked unconscious by an oxygen container and dragged into the vortex. Ryan woke up in the subclavian artery of another body filled with monsters. He discovered that the new body was also a code black environment, and he realized that his horrific past was about to repeat itself all over again. What a great fucking ending.